Rogue Justice by Geoffrey Household. Read by Jayston. Episode 1.
My first thought was that in a world where there was any mercy, I should have been killed then and there. For I had no doubt that a more protracted death, after days and nights of agony, awaited me. Yet I seemed to be the only living thing among the rubble, apart from 2 rats. When the shock of the explosion had worn off, and the only noises were the trickle of falling rubble and the occasional crash of heavier bits of masonry, I stood up cautiously. This provincial jail, where I was temporarily held, had taken a direct hit, as I learned much later, from a blockbuster, or a whole string of bombs dropped by the RAF in the first raid on Rostock. Meanwhile, the ancient wooden houses of the town were a giant bonfire, uninterrupted, inextinguishable. The bars of my somewhat antique cell still stood up and had sheltered me. On both sides the wall had collapsed. I staggered out, and looking for protection rather than a route to nowhere, felt my way under a massive beam, one end of which was still doing its duty in supporting a part of the floor above me. There I remained in a fantasy of hell. In black night there were tongues of red, though I could see no flames, and here and there tongues of silver, where crevices in chaos allowed the shafts of a low, bright moon to enter. First light came early so far north, and my tomb of black and red changed to a dim grey, in which objects could just be distinguished for what they were. One end of the corridor past the line of cells was open. Slinking along it like a beast through a line of beaters, I entered what had been the office and the guard room. Hauptmann Hase was sitting at his desk in a chair tilted backwards, and held in position by his knees. His head was flattened, but the rest of him outwardly intact. Another man, who must have taken the force of the blast, was, well, the detachable parts of him were scattered about somewhere. I remember him only as a splash on the wall. The Hauptmann must have been chatting to this man when a bomb fragment hit him in the face, flattening it beyond recognition and knocking him backwards. His head on its broken neck was hanging over the back of the chair, dripping in the dust, and not onto his uniform. Even before my partly conscious self had formed any plan, I began looking for that deadly Nicaraguan passport, once the very private property of the so-called Major Quive Smith, which had enabled me to return from Tangier to France, and France to Germany. It was in the top drawer of Hase's desk, and easy enough to find. A copy of his signal to Berlin HQ reporting my arrest was also there, along with a list of the clothes I was wearing, and the contents of my pockets, including my money. I took the passport and the money, and left the rest. I dragged the body out to my cell, and with great care removed the uniform and underclothes. I then dressed him in my own suit. That was very difficult, like putting a full sack into an empty one, while at the same time avoiding any stains. For me, his uniform was a tolerable fit, though baggy at the waist. However, I was unlikely to appear on parade, and it would serve. My last act was to lay the chunk of steel which had killed him close to the body and beneath a ragged hole in the ceiling through which it could have burst its way. With reasonable luck, no one could doubt that the corpse in the ruined cell was mine. I have started my story with the bomb that freed me, because it is from that point that I date my active participation in the war. But now I must explain my possession of the Nicaraguan passport, and how I used it in the hope of completing my vengeance for the torture and execution of my only love. After my single-handed attempt in 1938 to free the world of Hitler, and his agitated decision to return the compliment by eliminating me, I re-entered Germany from France in March 1939, travelling from Tangier as Ernesto Menendez Peraza, landowner of Nicaragua. This passport had belonged to that ingenious and able fellow who passed himself off as Major Quive Smith. I know now that his true name was von Lauen, that he belonged to a Prussian noble family long settled in Lithuania, and that he was educated at Eton. His enthusiasm for Hitler was due to a belief, natural to a descendant of Teutonic knights, that it was the mission of Germans to civilize Europe, plus any other handy points of the compass. Von Lauen was given the job of tracking me down. the right man. He was a crack shot who had hunted the forests of Europe, and he was out for, let us say, the solitary beast which becomes a man-killer. However, his trust in his employers was not so absolute that he failed to supply himself with a means of escape if necessary. And so, through bribery or friendship, he had acquired this Nicaraguan passport, which I took over from his body when the hunted had killed his hunter. The photograph, allowing for a cheap photographer, could conceivably be of me and would serve. But what I did not know, and ought to have guessed, was that he had told his wife, so that she could join him in Nicaragua if ever he found it advisable to disappear. When I arrived in Berlin as Ernesto Menendez Peraza, I settled down in a small furnished flat in the suburbs. My identity was never questioned. Nor was my story that, as a mature student of politics, I wished to study the ideals and organization of National Socialism. I cultivated the society of the scum who believed in their divine Führer and the mission of the Reich. Living very simply, I had enough money. While hiding in England, I had used little of the £5,000 which I had obtained from my solicitor, and I had naturally relieved von Lauern of the considerable sum of secret funds which he carried on him, and was not in a position to spend at the bottom of the Severn. As an enthusiast for the worldwide influence of the Reich, I began to talk of establishing dictatorships on the Pacific coast of Latin America, which would rule and expand under the guidance of the Nazi Party. This nonsense was taken seriously, and I was asked to lecture on the right of the superior Aryan man to extend his rule over Indians, Negroes, and mestizos. Now known as a propagandist, I was getting nearer and nearer to Hitler. Near enough, I hoped, to be able to use my bare hands to break his neck before I was shot down. And then came war. At long last, my country had become my ally, and there I was, stranded in enemy territory and unable to take part. As a neutral, I could reach Switzerland, Sweden, or Spain. But what were the chances of being shipped or flown to England? I had no fear of returning home. There was no conceivable reason why I should be accused of killing von Lauern. The police had been hot on my trail, and my appearance had been exactly described. A man with a damaged eye, always wearing gloves. But the identity of the criminal was unknown. The eye was now fairly normal, and my nails had grown back. I could not see my country ever accepting defeat. If only I were home, with what cruelty and cunning I could lead a unit of resistance or attack. And for Nazi Germany, victory was not enough. Hidden from the people, behind impenetrable, triumphant lines of swastika banners, the slaughter of the helpless began. The plain, decent citizen could not have guessed its extent, but among the excrement of the Reich, with which I drank and babbled, rumours of the concentration camps and the liquidation of communists and Jews circulated and were highly approved. I could bear no more of it. The fanatical patience of 3 years was exhausted. Vengeance on the man was beyond my powers. Vengeance on a poisoned nation was not. I decided that it was by Denmark and Sweden that I would try to get home. I hadn't a hope of doing it legally. Through influential friends, I had no trouble in getting as far as Denmark, as a known Nazi sympathizer and propagandist. Once in Copenhagen, I was disappointed to find that there was no passenger service at all between Denmark and Sweden. There was, however, more trade than I expected. Coasters came over on the short passage from Malmö with light cargo, and returned with anything that Germany could spare and Sweden needed. It might be possible to cross as a stowaway, provided I was free to enter Sweden on arrival. So I applied to the Swedish consul for a visa, which he gave me, at the same time warning me that I should never be allowed to leave Germany without a formal permit. That I knew only too well, but I was determined to be carried across the straits without any permission but my own. I welcomed with all my heart the straight challenge to straight action, after 3 years of intrigue and hypocrisy. Since the enemy kept up a diplomatic fiction that Denmark, though occupied, was still an independent country, the port police were officially Danish, and allowed small parties of seamen to come ashore. I followed several such groups and sat near them in cafes. But no faces or voices tempted me to gamble. I had to be very careful whom I approached. It was certain that the Gestapo would have their spies and agents provocateurs in the bars. On the third day I tailed 2 foreigners who were talking in Spanish. Worth a try. When they entered a bar, I stood beside them and introduced myself as a South American. As soon as the comradeship of the language had been established, I invited them to have a bite to eat with me. Over the table, I got their story of how the devil 2 Spaniards could be working on a Swedish ship. It turned out that they had been in the defeated Republican army and were among the few refugees who were evacuated to Russia. Like most foreign communists, they loathed their paradise. They had escaped to Finland and applied to go on to Sweden, where a token handful of Spanish refugees had been accepted. I could fearlessly tell such men that I too wanted to escape, but had not a hope of getting a permit. "Easy," they insisted. "Let's start by pretending to be drunk and raising hell. We'll all 3 be arrested. You will look for your pass and swear some son of a whore has pinched it out of your pocket. We'll keep on telling the police that you're a member of the crew, and if they take you back with us, the captain will confirm it." I objected that he would do nothing of the sort. But before I could protest, they started the hell-raising, singing the Internationale, breaking 2 glasses, and chucking smorgasbord at the ceiling. Thereafter, everything went as they had foretold, except for a deadly moment when the Danish police refused to allow me back on board with them. But they linked arms with me, 1 on each side, refused to let me go. And the police decided that their fellow Scandinavians on the ship might as well sort it out, and saved them trouble. We were escorted through the controls, marched on deck, and handed over to the first officer. He, who had no wish to get involved in an international incident, took all 3 of us before the captain, without bothering to denounce me. We were stormed at for getting drunk on foreign soil, and to my astonishment, he made no difference between us. I let my friends do the talking. The police, content with the captain's apparent recognition of me, departed. The 2 licensed jesters were ordered back to duty. I was shown into a bare cabin, which was promptly locked. I was left to myself, cursing my folly in trusting to a pair of lunatics, wishing that I had tried Switzerland, wondering how much pain I should suffer after my true identity had been discovered, until it was decided that I could be given a final kick and left to die. The captain, in the presence of police, had evidently been extremely discreet, in case the ship were accused of assisting and harbouring enemies of the state. But I was sure that before he sailed with his cargo of fertilizers, he was bound to hand me over in his own time to the right person. He came into the cabin, locking the door behind him. "And now who are you?" he asked in German. "A Nicaraguan and a neutral like yourself," I answered, showing my passport, duly visaed for Sweden. "Then you could have obtained permission to leave. Your passport is false," he suddenly snapped at me in perfect English. "I'm afraid it is, sir." "What is your true name?" At last I could see what had been in his mind as a possibility, and that he was ready to help. I was not prepared to give my true name until I was safely in our embassy, so I gave him a false one, saying that I had been taken prisoner at Calais in 1940. "Very well. Congratulations. I shall keep you locked up until we dock in Malmö, and I shall then send for an officer of your consulate and hand you over to him. And I ask you to give me your word of honor that you will never tell anyone except your own authorities that I accepted you on board." He handled the tricky situation very cleverly. In Malmö, the vice-consul came on board, and the necessary arrangements were made. In case German agents were carrying out a routine watch on the dock gates, as they certainly would be, I went ashore with other members of the crew. After a further interval to throw off any followers, I was put straight on the train to Stockholm and taken by car to a quiet residence outside the city. I remember what joy it was to be free. I could not sleep for joy. There had been some reserve among the British deputies who dealt with me, but it was to be expected. Next day I should be able to explain myself to someone in authority. Next day came, and still another, before I was interrogated. I realized that reference back to London for details of my birth certificate and all that was known of my past would take time. On the third day, a youngish man, but with deep creases on each side of his cordial, smiling mouth, came to visit me, plonked us both down in comfortable chairs, and began his questions. I remember every terrible word of that interrogation. Remember it better than my interrogation at Berchtesgaden. This professional was as good as theirs, and from my point of view, the suffering was more cruel than physical pain. I told him at once that my claim to be an escaped prisoner of war was a lie. I then had to explain how I came by the passport of Ernesto Menendez Peraza, which enabled me to avoid internment. I had, of course, thought up a plausible story. My mother came from an ancient family of diplomatists and soldiers. At the time of the declaration of war, I had been, I said, in the remote eastern province of Czechoslovakia, where the family still held a remnant of their former estates near Uzhgorod. None of us believed that Britain and Germany were on the verge of war. If the British government had not fought when Czechoslovakia was invaded, why on earth should it fight for Poland? I was caught, still hesitating, in enemy territory, a long way from organized evacuation of British citizens, and was certain to be interned for the duration of the war. So I claimed to have been hidden on the estate. A Nicaraguan passport was bought for me, and I had been able to live as a harmless neutral. My interrogator was surprised that I had not tried to escape earlier, because I could not find any safe method of doing so, which would not have got my family into severe trouble if I were caught. By the way, your Nicaraguan passport was issued by the Paris consulate in 1938, not 1939. The date was false. Now please, let me have the truth. As it is, I can only report that you entered Germany in 1938, returned in 1939, and that you wish to keep it quiet. Was it a political reason that took you there? Foolishly, I had expected that my word would be sufficient. I had never expected close questioning. The holes in my story were obvious. The only thing left was to confess. The purpose of both journeys was to assassinate Hitler. I see. What a pity you didn't. Have you any proof of that? I had not. It was unthinkable to let anyone know of my intention to kill a head of state in time of peace. There was always the danger that I could be accused of acting as an agent of the British government. That was precisely what von Lauen, in his avatar of Clive Smith, had demanded that I confess in writing. I have no proof. When did you change your opinion of Hitler? I have never changed it. We have fairly accurate reports of the movements and interests of neutrals within Germany. I have some of Don Ernesto's newspaper articles and reports of his speeches. All that was to enable me to get close to Hitler. And did it? No. In the end, I decided I was wasting my time and ought to be serving my country directly. Certainly you ought. And you really believed that with your record we should allow you into wartime Britain. But I am British. I don't doubt it. What I do not know is whether you are one of those arrogant members of the upper class who are proud to wear black shirts and betray humanity for the sake of power which the people will never give them. Or perhaps you are a paid German agent, provided with a suspiciously stupid German story. Which are you? Neither. I've told you the truth. You have told me a pack of lies. And England in wartime would be better without you. Give that some thought when you are returned with thanks. You cannot return me. That is up to the Swedish government. As far as we are concerned, you are Ernesto Menendez Peraza, and your passport is in perfect order. I have no doubt that the Swedes will discreetly slip you back into Copenhagen, without any need to state how you got there. I was handed over to some operatives of what I presume was the Swedish Secret Service. They talked to me quite frankly. I could be secretly shoved over the frontier into occupied Norway and left to fend for myself, or I could stay in Sweden until there was a chance of shipping me across the Atlantic, which might be arranged later in the year. I did not like either alternative. I had been prevented from joining the armed services of my country until it was too late. Therefore, I was determined to enter the war alone, to kill alone, and myself receive death alone. I came up with a simple solution. I am authorized to reside in Berlin, I said. I have a permit to visit Denmark. I have the correct visa to enter Sweden. All this you can see from my passport. The only thing I do not have is the German exit permit. Why don't you forge it? It will never be noticed, and I can then return openly. This appeared to the good Swedes rather too disreputable, but they went into a huddle and agreed that it might be done. So I was put on a ship from Gothenburg and landed in Copenhagen with my papers in perfect order. It was, I thought, too easy. Of course it was. As soon as I set foot in Copenhagen, 2 members of the Gestapo checked the details of my passport and arrested me. No reason was given. No questions were put. I suppose that my unauthorized visit to Sweden must have become known, though I could not believe that the Swedes or my compatriots had given me away. I was escorted for 6 silent hours down to Rostock by road and ferry. The car stopped outside the jail. My body was signed for, and I was taken to my cell. That I was in danger of everything that Nazi brutality could do to me was obvious. But why? Some hours later I was taken before Hauptmann Hase. He came pretty straight to the point.
To whom does this passport really belong?
To me, of course.
Not to a certain von Lauen?
This was so unexpected that eyes or face must have given me away, though I tried to remain unmoved. But I've been in Berlin for 3 years, and my passport has never been questioned.
Never, you swine, until you came in from Sweden. But you are caught at last.
He jumped up and hit me across the face.
You, a friend of the Führer?
But you have forgotten the true heart of a German wife and mother.
Again and again she asked for news of her husband, von Lauen. The only reply the state could give her was that it knew nothing. And then, 3 long weeks ago, she told us that in order to serve the fatherland, should he find himself abroad in time of war, he bought a Nicaraguan passport and gave us the date and number. All were warned to look out for it. Every post in the Reich. This is it. You are a spy and an impostor. I would like to deal with you myself, but my orders are to send you to Berlin to account for all the filth you have committed. They will soon have the truth out of you there. And so I was taken back to my cell to brood over the inevitable outcome that I should be recognized as the hunter who had attempted to send the Holy Führer to the pit of hell reserved for him, whom von Lauen had tracked down from London to Dorset, and then to the bestial hole in that deserted lane, where at last I had killed him. After the bombing, it seemed safe to assume that everyone else in that antique police station was either incapacitated or dead. Could I find a way out to the open? A concrete pillar had crashed down, leaving a gap through which I crawled. Beyond was only a buckled, bulging brick wall. Since the pillar provided protection, I dared to batter at the wall with a stout table leg. This was effective. There was a roar of falling masonry, and when the dust cleared, I found that I had opened a way into the courtyard. It was full of onlookers, apparently waiting for the worst, and a party of police and auxiliaries who were digging frantically with pick and shovel. 2 ambulances were parked near the outer gate. A fire engine was standing close to the ruins, ready for action. With so many people standing about, there was no hope of getting from courtyard to gate unobserved. I had to divert the attention of the enemy. Shattered cars standing in a lake of petrol suggested a way. Scraps of paper were everywhere. Wallpaper, files, and best of all, a roll of toilet paper still attached to a pyramid of white tiles. I dropped the end of this into the petrol and crawled away, unwinding the rest as I went. I tucked myself under a piece of corrugated iron, found matches in the Hauptmann's pocket, and lit the fuse. The explosion brought the brick wall down, and before the dust had cleared, I was running for the gate. The courtyard was now like a disturbed ant's nest, with everyone in movement. I doubt if I was noticed at all. If I was, I should naturally be mistaken for the crouching, running figure of the late captain. Outside the gate I turned left, away from the crowd in front of the building. I walked fast and importantly down the street, which was empty. Looking onto the prison courtyard was a wounded, windowless house with no guard on it, so I entered, as if on business. What I needed was a clothes brush, a boot brush, and a drink. I found all three, shaved off Don Ernesto's moustache, and sat down to examine Haas's papers. I was unfamiliar with the organization of the Sicherheitsdienst, Hitler's secret security service, for it was not publicized. Haase was commissioned in the Gestapo, but wore as well the insignia of the SD, so he was no ordinary political policeman. He appeared to be under the direct orders of the Reich Security Head Office, with authority to do anything and go anywhere, subject to reporting to the commanding officer of the district SD. I had to get out of town as soon as possible, and an SD officer ought to be able to manage that without showing his pass. Now, fairly clean, I left the house and set out for the railway station. My general manner as an officer and no gentleman was authentic enough. I had watched so many of them.
Michael Jayston was reading episode 1 of Rogue Justice by Geoffrey Household. The book was abridged by Patricia Hanna, and the producer was David Jackson Young. Rogue Justice by Geoffrey Household. Read by Michael Jayston. Episode 2.
The railway station in Rostock was clouded by smoke and in turmoil, for lines had been damaged in the air raid, and it took a great deal of shunting and shouting to get a train together. Meanwhile, 2 battalions of infantry, which should have been entrained hours before, were patiently making themselves as comfortable as possible in the yards and the forecourt. I was wearing the uniform that I had taken from Hauptmann Haase's body, and reckoned, rightly as it turned out, that no one would question a Gestapo officer. I had a chat with the transport officer about the iniquity of bombing innocent open cities, which good Germans would never do except in justified reprisal, and I got my travel voucher. Yes, the train should leave in 20 minutes. My railway pass stated my destination as Berlin, but I had no intention of visiting such a concentration of security where my face might conceivably be recognized. I got off the troop train at Stettin. When I walked away from the train into the goods yard, I was very far from feeling the happy warrior. I was a badly wanted man in the heart of enemy country, with no assets but a uniform and a headquarters pass with the wrong photograph on it. No strategy at all could be planned. Tactics depended on the single weapon of Haase's loaded pistol and a spare magazine. As I hesitated, lonely, lost and separated from all the military activity on the station, I saw a sergeant and corporal of the Gestapo hurrying down the line towards me, and was seized with unreasoning panic. Shoot my way out, or run? My hand was on my holster. I had to remind myself that I was no longer Don Ernesto, but the superior officer of these fellows, correctly uniformed and unquestionable. But it was not until they gave me a smart salute in coming abreast that I recovered self-confidence. I stopped them. "You are travelling on duty?" I asked. "Escort, sir. Guards on the prisoners are changed here." "That's a job for the SS, not us," I said. "Well, sir, it's not a convoy. Just 4 dirty Poles being sent to do some honest work at Auschwitz. They won't enjoy it there, they won't." "Oh, those 4. Yes, I was present when they were caught. That must be the reason why I am ordered to accompany you. Further interrogation, probably." Safe, untraceable departure from Stettin was being offered me on a plate, and I accepted it. I had never heard of Auschwitz, and returned to my arrival platform for a look at the map displayed there. It appeared to be the place the Poles called Oswiecim, which was a junction for several lines. The expected train probably went on to Krakow, and so would I. In 10 minutes the Krakow train came in, and the new guard on the prisoners entered the reserved compartment. I followed. Wishing them a good journey, I went forward to the first class. Of the 4 prisoners, 2 might be described as in comparatively good health after being entertained by the Gestapo. One of them was obviously in pain, doubled up with his forearms on his knees. The other had half his face so badly bruised that I suspected a broken cheekbone. The remaining two were spread out on the floor. Evidently the guard had been unwilling to share seats with such Schweinerei. They were also conveniently placed for kicks. It was not only pity that compelled me to set them free. I needed them. If they were Poles and guilty of belonging to some underground organization, they might be able to help me. Night was coming down, and the train was gathering speed over a flat and melancholy plain with an occasional gleam of water. The difficulty was how to dispose of the guards. I was still, in those days, legally minded, in the sense that my solitary war should obey the rules of public war. The guards were in enemy uniform, and could therefore be killed. On the other hand, they were not in action, and I was in no danger from them. I decided that they should arrange their own decease. A touch of hypocrisy there, I think. The fact was that I dared not fire 2 shots in case the sound was heard before I had time to clear up. When it was dark and window blinds drawn, I entered that closed and sinister compartment with a cheerful word. The 2 escorts jumped up. "I will now tell you why I'm here," I said. "These prisoners are to have an accident while trying to escape. We will throw them out, taking care that they fall on their heads." Then, drawing my pistol, I told the poor devil with the broken face to stand up, ordered the sergeant to get those fellows off the floor, and the corporal to open the door halfway, and be careful he didn't fall out. They were startled and hesitated, but the orders had come smartly in succession, and they had only time to obey and not to think. One of the Poles on the floor cried out in horror. The other 3 showed no fear, but only proud, sullen acceptance. The corporal opened the door and had some trouble controlling it against the wind with no firm grip. I slammed the butt of the pistol down on his head and kicked him out. Then I whipped round and covered the sergeant. I had not worked this move out. But hatred gave wings to the prisoner, who was doubled up in pain. He undoubled himself, leapt at the sergeant, and got an arm over his mouth. The rest of the walking wounded were on him in a flash, and he joined his partner on the permanent way, head first. "Don't be afraid, and shut the door," I said. I let them know at once that I was British, not German. Broken Face replied in English, which he spoke very well. He said something in Polish to the other 3, who relaxed. Poor doubled up, collapsed in agony, with the return of the pain which he had momentarily forgotten in action. "When shall we get off and disappear?" I asked. "You know the country, and I don't. We are now about an hour from Auschwitz, where you are going, so the Krakow train will stop there. I can probably manage to have an emergency stop earlier. Can any of you say where we should have the best chance of getting clear away? Then if you can find me some civilian clothes, I will look after myself, and not be an embarrassment to you and your friends." I was accepted. Doubled Up told us that Krakow was his home. Broken Face added that he had once been duck shooting over the nearby marshes, that there was little cover, and he doubted if we could reach the forest before we were surrounded and caught. The Committee of Life and Death agreed that I should not attempt to stop the train, drawing attention to ourselves by getting off in the middle of nowhere. We had better trust to luck and my uniform on arrival at Auschwitz. I returned to my first-class compartment and kept watch as we pulled into Auschwitz. A sergeant and private of the SS, both armed with machine pistols, were waiting on the platform. The 4 prisoners were ordered out of their compartment with their hands behind their heads. There were sharp questions about the missing guards. Then they were marched away to a closed truck, pushed inside, and the rear door fastened with an iron bar. I called out to the sergeant. "You there! 2 bodies of our men have been seen on the line. Immediate investigation. Both of you search the compartment and report to me. Never mind your prisoners for the moment. They can't get out." The sergeant and the private both ran back to the prisoners' compartment and climbed in. I made for the truck as fast as I could. It started sweetly, and we were off. The Krakow road was not at all promising, since it could easily be blocked. Marsh ponds and muddy streams were everywhere, crossed by causeways or small bridges. In the night, our course over this maze of fenland appeared more confusing than it really was. owing to extensive drainage works. We had done about a third of the distance to Krakow when headlights winked and twisted far behind us, but fast approaching. The pursuit was bound to overtake us, so there was nothing for it but to give battle. My first battle. I stopped on a narrow bridge for single-line traffic, threw open the rear doors of our truck, and told my four to scatter and take whatever good cover they could find. Left alone, I tried to outthink the enemy. They would naturally assume that we had abandoned our transport on the bridge to delay pursuit, and that we ourselves had got away on foot. They would also assume that our party was unarmed, with a question mark over the SD officer, who might be a traitor, or might have been killed or kidnapped. In any case, the only arm the fugitive possessed was his automatic. On the right-hand side of the road was a hard shoulder, which was bounded by a bank of raw earth. On the left of the road were only rushes, waving gently in the night breeze. I took position on the reverse side of the earth bank. A vehicle roared up and stopped short of the bridge. It seemed to be a staff car, specially adapted for the capture of escapers, for a searchlight was mounted behind the front seat, with a light machine gun below it. 6 men jumped out, and for a moment stood together in a bunch, proof that they were not expecting any armed opposition. The searchlight was then manned, its beams sweeping the desolate far side of the stream. I couldn't see any of my party, who must have been clinging to the ground in ruts or behind lumps of mud. Having first satisfied themselves that the truck on the bridge was empty, 2 men climbed the earth bank as I had foreseen. At a range of 20 feet, I was able to kill them cleanly, without any trouble. Response was immediate. Their machine gunner harmlessly peppered the crest of the bank. The searchlight swept it from end to end, and the other 2 delivered a flank attack, this time with proper care. Meanwhile, the bridge was in darkness, allowing me to get away while still remaining in contact. Movements thereafter had to depend on those of the enemy, now reduced to 4. I ducked under the bridge, clinging to the lattice girder of the steel arch. I heard our truck rattling over my head, its headlights shining on the road beyond. With 1 man lighting up the earth bank and 2 chasing shadows, only 1 was left to drive the truck over the bridge and park it clear of the road. A definite objective at last presented itself: to drive on to Krakow in that imposing staff car, provided I remained alive to capture it. Praying that the searchlight would remain busy, I crept out from under the bridge and padded softly across the open to the back of the truck. The driver had just switched off the engine, and he was at my mercy, but I did not want to fire a shot. After knocking him out with the butt of the weapon, I put him in the back of the truck, closed the door, and settled down behind the bonnet, waiting for the inexplicable silence of night to have its effect on the others. I did not have to wait long. The lonely man at the searchlight called to his 2 comrades to return to the car. When they had joined him, he drove across the bridge and stopped at the truck. I was unfamiliar with a machine pistol and had been looking for the safety catch. I found it in plenty of time. A nasty, deadly killer at close quarters. They were all 3 of them in an open car, only 10 feet away. I shouted in English and German to summon my companions, and at last they appeared. 2 of them carrying the body of one of the poor devils who had been on the floor of the train. The exertion had been too much for that living substance, tortured and twisted by his interrogators, and used as a footstool by the guards. I could not think what to do with my prisoner, but Broken Face had no doubt. He emptied a magazine into him. Passionate, foolish, understandable hatred. We now had 2 free uniforms. 2 more were unwearable. Broken Face put on one, and I took the other, changing my rank from captain to private. Then we drove after Krakow in a towering thunderstorm, which helped to clean up the car. There was at last time to hear my companion's stories. Doubled Up and Broken Face had both been demobilized after the defeat of Poland, then picked up and sent off to forced labor at Kiel Canal, without a chance of communicating with wives or families. They had organized a camp mutiny, which was betrayed before it got off the ground, and they were interrogated and sent off to Auschwitz. Man on the floor, who turned out to be German, had a different, even sadder story. He was a Jew, a landowner, who had escaped from a concentration camp and had been helped and hidden by a good Christian farmer until he was caught. They wanted the name of that decent, civilized man. They hadn't got it. Man on the floor was proud of that, what was left of him. Dawn was just breaking as we arrived on the outskirts of Krakow. Twice on seeing our slowly cruising car, pedestrians vanished like rabbits round corners or into gardens, for we were obviously a Gestapo patrol which had picked up some wretched citizens. We entered a suburb of empty factories from which the workers had been seized for slave labour in the Reich, and found a quiet spot in a damaged warehouse, where we parked well inside the gate. Doubled Up came out with a proposal which was better than nothing. He insisted that he could force himself to walk, and that walk he would. "I shall go to the great square," he said. "There will be people passing through on their way to work or to the university, and I may meet some old friend who will remember how I disappeared. No one is ever allowed back, so he will know I am in trouble." His plan was that about 8:30 we should drive slowly along one side of the square. He would be sitting on a seat, and would blow his nose on a white handkerchief, if any of us had such a thing. The late Hauptmann Hase had. When we should pick him up quickly. He would then tell us if he had had any success, and direct us where to drive. When Doubled Up had gone, our Jew took me on one side, and said that he was too weak to be of any use to us. I replied with unthinking cheerfulness that if he thought we had no future, he should try to find some of his own people to shelter him. "There are none left in Krakow." I was astonished. No one knew better than I the rabid Nazi cruelty in Germany, which had dismembered and killed the only love of my past and all my future. But I did not realize that all Jews in conquered Europe were being rounded up, as well as those of the Reich. "What are they doing with them all?" "I only know rumors. Terrible rumors." I told him I would never leave him until he was in safety or dead. We got out of the car, and from behind a wall kept watch on the gate of the warehouse, ready for escape on foot if anyone were to show interest in us. Nobody did. The main question was whether to drive away as civilians or privates of the Gestapo. We decided on the latter, for our civilian clothes were too filthy and disreputable. I was to continue driving, while Broken-Face was to sit in the back guarding our Jew, whose features could hardly be anything but proudly Semitic. Good cover, if questioned. We had unearthed one of the last of them. Dear God, what a city it was when we reached the centre of it. How dared these sewer rats describe the Poles as Untermenschen, when their ancient capital was one of the flowers of Europe? I was ashamed to have been ignorant of such a seat of learning. Its age, beauty, and peace comparable to the inner courts of Oxford. The peace now was that of silence, for the professors were in jail, and the students scattered. The splendid square was a little more animated than any of the streets through which we had passed, though still comparatively empty. A few soldiers were strolling about with cameras. We spotted Doubled Up and his handkerchief, and when we repassed him, Broken-Face leapt from the car and threw him in. He had enough experience to know every cold and brutal gesture of the Gestapo, and his impersonations must have been convincing, for nobody interfered. Doubled Up had seen 4 or 5 former acquaintances, but only one had recognized him. This friend had sat down next to him with no sign of welcome, and eventually listened to his story as if it were a casual, rather boring conversation with a stranger. He did not know enough to tell Doubled Up where and how we could find safety, but did tell him what our first port of call should be. We should go in civilian dress to a little village near the banks of the Vistula and get in touch with the priest who would warn the partisans of our presence. It was essential to get rid of the car some distance away, so that no suspicion could possibly fall on the village. We had no trouble on the road, but the nearer we got to our destination, the more formidable the difficulties appeared. We had to hide the car. Broken-Face and I had to change, as instructed, to civilian clothes. He still had with him his ragged coat and stained trousers, but I seemed doomed to remain a private of the Gestapo. The country was open, and though it seemed sparsely inhabited, our movements could be watched. and so it was essential to find a safe place where we could wait till nightfall and then approach the priest. We followed a track very roughly paved with stones down to a tributary stream of the Vistula, hoping to find a tall reed bed on fairly solid ground. There was nothing of the sort, and when the track led us past a small patch of woodland on higher ground, we chose it for a temporary hiding place, although our presence could not be concealed from a few peasants in distant fields. We outlaws lay down on the soft dead leaves for much-needed rest, myself on the edge of the open to be warmed by the sun. I must have slept, for I remember suddenly jumping to my feet on hearing shots, and equally suddenly dropping flat again as bullets cut into the turf alongside me. I rolled over into cover and watched the development of a skillful attack by a small party of poorly equipped German infantry. However, there was nothing wrong with their short bursts of fire, to which we could not reply because our weapons were in the car. It was all up. I found that I was empty and didn't care very much. I had time to be sorry for my companions, who would have preferred to die fighting. It was our Jew who saved us by simply walking out into the open. The enemy did not attempt to shoot him down, and may have been surprised that we continued to hold our fire. He strolled on, upright and fearless, towards a man whose head was sometimes visible behind a patch of nettles. Fortunately, he understood German, stood up and shouted to his comrades. 5 of them were there. It seems incredible that till then Broken Face and I, so tired and so obsessed by mental and physical antagonism to the enemy, had entirely forgotten that we were wearing the enemy's uniform. Our friends explained that when they heard that a car with German soldiers and prisoners had driven into the wood, the local underground had nipped into their enemy tunics and come out for the kill. They had not been able to understand our lack of resistance, and were about to rush us, when the only man with any intelligence had the courage to walk out and explain. When I told them I was British, they were almost reverent. They supposed I belonged to some suicidal secret mission, and thought it unfair that an officer who could not speak Polish should have been chosen. A secret mission was about right, though authorized by no one but myself. We told them at once that between us we had killed 7 of the SD and Gestapo, and that they must expect all the troops in the garrison to be called out to search for us. If the underground were willing to take the risk of helping us, action had to be immediate. They emptied the car of the weapons and uniforms. For them it was a precious haul. The whole lot was manhandled into the wood, and covered up well enough for a casual eye. Final disposal would be carried out after nightfall. Their leader, Casimir, a tall, powerful man with dark hair and a straight, full moustache, decided to take Broken Face and Doubled Up with them. Both could be securely hidden until identity documents had been forged for them, when they would be as safe as any other villager, which wasn't saying much. The Jew and I were a problem out of the ordinary, since we could not pass as Poles. It would be best, Casimir thought, if we remained in the wood until he returned with some agreed plan for us and the car. It was after midday when they left, with at least 8 hours to go till darkness was deep enough for Casimir to come out to fetch us. For a while we could blessedly relax in the sun, cheating hunger with 2 cold baked potatoes and a small flask of vodka, which were all they had. I have continued to call my companion our Jew, as if he were some kind of exotic pet, because until then names were unimportant in the rush of the escape. I have forgotten what Doubled Up and Broken Face were really called, but never can I forget Moshe Shapir, my companion in the wood, and thereafter. The first we heard of the return of the partisans was the soft plodding of horses approaching over the grass. Not a light was shown, while arms and uniforms were packed onto a hay cart drawn by 2 of the horses. The car, Casimir informed us, would be sunk in the Vistula. He had brought a threadbare suit of civilian clothes for me, and to my surprise, 3 horses saddled and waiting. I asked him what were the chances of a successful escape into Slovakia. He replied that the passes were heavily guarded, and whatever we pretended to be, we should not get through. "Unless you can bluff your way over in that uniform," he added. "We have had it thoroughly cleaned for you. Beautiful boots, friend. Beautiful boots to kick with." I told him the risk was too great. I could not pretend to be Haase, with a photograph that was no likeness. I would wear his boots and keep his pistol and documents, but abandon his uniform, which was too bulky anyway to be carried on my back. I must use the skills of a hunter. Arms, not bluff. I was sure of myself in mountain and forest. "You can't avoid the tops," he said, "and you'll find them very bare and closely watched. They mean to keep their Polish slaves where they belong. Judging by what your two friends say of you, you're as cunning as a lynx and deadly as rabies. But you'd better leave this poor chap in my charge. He'll hold you back. I have promised that I won't desert him." "If only he could ride," said Casimir. "If it has 4 legs, I can ride it," Moshe replied, when I had translated this for him. "I used to train horses." We had to lift Moshe into the saddle, but once he was there, I recognized that he and his horse were one living thing. Under cover of darkness, we set out across the open fields in single file. Soon we were in the foothills of the Tatra. On the flanks of the wide valley up which we rode, agriculture gave way to forest. The slopes steepened. It was becoming country in which I could avoid capture indefinitely, given a supply of food. But I could not see how Moshe would ever be able to climb out of the valleys when we were left on our own. I drew up alongside Casimir to ask him if he had any plans. "There are Germans on the Polish side of the frontier," he replied, "and their posts are well placed and very difficult to avoid. I will go with you as far as the tree line, and set you on a route which will take you down into Slovakia without any more climbing." At the edge of the forest, we regretfully said goodbye to our saviour, Casimir. He had left his people alone too long. The most troublesome duty of a leader of partisans was, he said, to prevent premature adventures, which could lead to penetration of the cell. Any indiscretion could be fatal to all of them, if the presence of doubled up and broken face in the village, together with the uniforms and arms, were discovered. We watched him ride away, leading our 2 horses. I can only hope that his instinct for survival in the midst of German and then Russian armies carried his courageous little cell safely through to the Poland they served. Moshe and I turned and set out for the frontier.
Michael Jayston was reading Episode 2 of Rogue Justice by Geoffrey Household. The book was abridged by Patricia Hannah, and the producer was David Jackson Young. Rogue Justice by Geoffrey Household. Read by Michael Jayston. Episode 3.
Moshe Shapir and I struggled painfully down one valley and up to a ridge whose narrow top was all rock and pines and led gently downhill. The frontier straddled the ridge and was somewhere below us. The first sign of it was a wooden watchtower, unexpected in the wilderness. The summit of the ridge, with its fairly open forest and silent, easy going over the pine needles, must have been a favorite route for illicit travelers between Poland and Slovakia. Trees had been cut down along the line, so that I could get a good view of the post from the edge of the remaining cover. There was a guard close to the watchtower, and barbed wire, an impassable roll of it, closing the approach. I was sure that since this old smuggler's route had been blocked, the regular valley passes would be controlled even more tightly. I studied the roughly drawn map that Casimir had given me, and thought we ought to aim for the plateau where Moshe could easily manage short marches over the turf, and we could see trouble from far off before we walked into it. The best plan was to drop down into the eastern valley, cross another ridge and valley, and then strike up a fairly easy escarpment until we came out of the forest onto the uplands, where we should meet only shepherds. We crossed the ridge to its eastern side, and then felt our way down through the pines, very slowly traversing the slope until we came to a flat terrace where the darkness was darker than the night, indicating thick cover overhead. There we ate the last of our food supply and slept a little, while waiting for enough light to be able to choose a path down to the bottom of the valley. The next ridge took us a full day to climb and descend. Next morning we started on the easy march up through the dappled world of the broad-leaved forest. East it was, but pathless and seemingly endless. Where the pines began, I spotted a young roebuck, which stayed a second too long to satisfy its curiosity. I lit a fire and had begun to grill the chops when we were fiercely and unmistakably challenged in Polish. I replied in French and English, saying that we were fugitives from Krakow. A horseman crashed through the undergrowth towards us, while another threw light on us. We were marched off into the open, where I saw a shadowy group of 4 more mounted men and a baggage horse carrying a light machine gun. Finding that we did not understand Polish, the commander of this band demanded in German, good Viennese German of the old empire, to know our names and our business. I told him that we were trying to cross into Slovakia, and that for the present we thought it best to have no names. Then why had we been making noise enough to arouse all the Tatra? I replied with another question. Had he ever heard of a certain man named Casimir? At once the atmosphere of suspicion was changed. I was allowed to explain the difficulties we had encountered at the frontier, our journey, and my killing of the roebuck. That was the firing we heard? That was the firing you heard. And if the frontier post is anywhere near, they will have heard it too. So be careful. They won't turn out in force till daylight. Shots in the night are nothing new, and this lot value their skins. Now come with us. My companion is still recovering from what the Gestapo did to him, I said, and he must not walk any more. Have you a spare horse? He himself immediately dismounted and helped Moishe into the saddle. We marched a few miles to the east, where again we entered the forest, and arrived at what seemed a temporary bivouac, cunningly placed on the edge of a gorge, which could not be seen at all from the high tops, and would appear to an observer on the opposite side of the valley merely as a terrace of the cliff, wide enough to support a mixture of beech and pine. Here were a dozen more partisans, with plenty of food and ammunition, and another light machine gun. They could not risk a fire, but otherwise seemed to be carefree and at home. I asked if they were all Poles. No, my friend. We represent the provinces of the vanished empire. Here are Poles, Slovaks, a Czech, 2 Romanians from the Bukovina, and myself, an Austrian. I represent, in all but its hopeless inefficiency, Imperial Vienna, when at least we remained Europeans and men of honor. For me, as for my ancestors, frontiers are only a nuisance. He delighted in his irony, reminding me of all the smash and grab since March 1939. The Czechs were swallowed by Hitler. Slovakia timidly put herself under his protection. Poland and Hungary collected a common frontier from the garbage. And after the defeat of Poland, Russia took her slice of Poland, and in 1940 annexed Bessarabia and Bukovina from Romania. And now the Russians are back on the Volga, and the frontiers are a spider's web of abandoned posts and wire. No one knows them as we do, not even the garrison commanders. What are your objectives? Simple: to squash these lice who crawl over honor and humanity. If you care to join us, I will welcome a Jew, who I can see remains a fine horseman in spite of the Gestapo. And I welcome an Englishman, who has the national virtue of gnawing the enemy while keeping his mouth shut. I could see no point in keeping my mouth shut any longer, so I gave him my history since the escape from Rostock, without mentioning how I got there. And where do you want to go? To join the armed forces of my country in the Middle East. And if I cannot, I will fight alone. I think perhaps you are in love with death, he said. I have had for so long nothing else to be in love with. Not life? For a little while life gave me all I could ever ask. Now only death remains. You talk like a Russian refugee, he said cheerfully. This is the Tatra, not Montmartre. Have another drink. Peacefully we ate and drank in the moonlight, each suppressing his curiosity about the other. Moishe had found 2 German speakers and was inspecting horses with a glass in his hand, taken back into memories beyond the reach of pain. How do you come to speak German so well? The commander asked me. My mother was Austrian, and I often visited her parents. Where? Not far from Uzhgorod in Slovakia. They lived on what was left of their estate. I suspect your maternal grandfather must have been the Graf von Darmsdorff, but I am ignorant of his English descendants. It is better so. We should not try to find out names. No one can ever be sure that he will keep silence under all they can do to him. In these mountains, I am known only as the Voivod. Darmshof's son and my father were pages at the imperial court, together with a younger son of Prince Oyesberg. Happy days in Vienna under Franz Joseph and his half-wit ministers who landed Europe where it is. Oyesberg married a Jewess. People still talk of their daughter. She had the fire and beauty of both the bloods. I saw her once. Irresistible. A man could create himself a poet just to pay tribute to her. Indeed he could. Dark, slender lioness of love and courage, who commands to this day my soul and inhibits my body from the desire of any other woman. You, my treasure, whom I avenge. She gave those damn Austrian Nazis no peace, he went on. Plotting violence for violence, it seems, as well as propaganda. She was often in England. You may have met her. Yes. Then she returned to Austria, and she and her father reorganized the cells of international resistance. Then in 1937, when the Nazis and their Austrian supporters burst in and raped the state, father and daughter were quietly removed to Germany. Silence is the worst cruelty of dictatorship, he said. There was a rumor that she was shot. Shot? Do you think they can be as merciful as that? I had not meant to say more, but he shared the memory of her, and from a single meeting. They tore her apart, slowly, I told him, inch by inch, between the questions, and still she would not talk. They let her die. She didn't count. After all, she was only half Aryan. How do you know? Because her father told me. They made him watch. He gave them the names they wanted, but it was too late. He was sent home with a memory that was worse than torture. He killed himself. Sentries were posted high above us. The camp of the partisans slept on its hidden ledge. In the morning, the Voivod asked me how I intended to reach the British Army in the Middle East. My best hope is to Romania, and then by sea to neutral Turkey. Have you any papers at all beyond those of Haze? A valid passport in the name of Ernesto Menendez Peraza, landowner of Nicaragua. But that would let you through? It would, if Don Ernesto had not been involved in an attempt to assassinate Hitler. Would German frontier guards have your name on their blacklist? Yes, at the top of it. But ordinary Romanian guards might not. Well, he said, I can help you on your way a little. We are running short of ammunition, and I have learned that we may get it across the frontier in what was Russia. They left Poland in a hurry. The following night we set out, passing round the Dukla Peak and then south. The moon helped, but I was astonished how this pack of frontier wolves could keep on course across the featureless watershed, always ready, if threatened, to split up, radiating into the valley forests and reuniting after days of concealment. Every man was self-supporting in food and weapons. Dawn, after our second night's bivouac, brought back memories of early youth. I knew where I was. Through a V between the hills, I could catch a glimpse of the plain of the Tisa and see part of a broken line of wire and blockhouses which marked the frontier, a frontier which had lasted only 2 years. The day was spent gathering more local intelligence. Our own Slovaks were out on foot, mixing with the peasants. 2 shepherds found us and gave us the local news. We heard that nobody paid much attention to the former frontier, that it was very lightly garrisoned, and that it would take time to concentrate enough troops to hold us up on our passage from forest to forest. Our daring Viennese commander made the mistake of Franz Josef and the Czechs in believing that no Slovaks were pro-German. He decided to move down to agricultural land and take position in the evening, just inside the last of the woods. There we had open country in front of us for 4 or 5 miles. We were to rush this in a bunch instead of sneaking across one by one, and should reach safe refuge in the tangled foothills on the other side as night closed in. And so began my second battle. We emerged from the trees in two ragged columns. To our right was open country, with a couple of blockhouses. To our left, at an angle of 45 degrees to our advance, was a narrow valley running up into the hills with a stream at the bottom. We were all trotting fast to cross the long stretch of open land and have time to find some easily defendable position for the night. I was riding along near the front of the left-hand column, remembering days of the 1920s and the adventurous happy youth who cantered out into these valleys, past peasants doffing their caps, when a blast of machine-gun fire hit us from the front. My horse was shot under me, in the best tradition of wars of the last century, and I pitched over its shoulder in a fall more sudden than that of the hunting field, but no worse. Lying still with bullets spitting earth at me, I vaguely remembered that cavalry horses sometime somewhere were trained to lie down while the rider fired over the body as if it were a sandbag. That seemed hard on the horse, but mine was already dead. I slid into that useful cover and took a quick glance over it. Half the left-hand column were down, and the survivors had raced for the nearby valley. The right-hand column had not suffered so badly, and were off their horses and returning fire. I unslung my rifle and prepared to join in. It was obvious what had happened. The enemy had learned of our movements late in the day, and while we were still in the trees short of the frontier, had correctly assessed our intentions, and seized the opportunity for a successful ambush, moving whatever men were available into the stream bed which ran across our front. Uniforms glimpsed, but too quickly for action, suggested that these frontier troops were Slovaks under experienced German command. They were showing no exaggerated enthusiasm for action. They ought to have been able to wipe us out instead of pinning us down. But neither side were going to rise from the earth and risk annihilation before nightfall. In the deep dusk there was some movement. I could vaguely make out the Slovaks crawling like crocodiles out of the stream bed. There was some firing, but I think no casualties. Then what was left of our right column rushed forward and found the position unoccupied. They caught the few horses which had bolted out of the line of fire and went straight on towards the distant wooded hills, which had been our original objective. I did not follow. It occurred to me that the enemy might have fallen back to a more serious line, where they could receive reinforcements and stop our escape. The deep and narrow valley into which half our left-hand column had galloped seemed a safe spot, so long as the head of it was not closed. So, half a dozen of us disappeared into it, carrying our wounded who had a chance of recovery. We were too small a band to have medical services, and when we moved on, we heard a few shots from men who had decided on death at their own hands rather than the enemy's. They knew there would be no mercy for them in the morning, unless for those who were kept alive long enough to be interrogated. As we advanced up the valley, the rising moon showed enough of it for me to recognize. There I had ridden as a boy. I had even killed a harmless wolf there. We caught up with the rest of the left column. They had suffered more severely than the right, and I was very glad to find Moisha unhurt. The voivod, in the way of commanders, was more inclined to congratulate the enemy than to blame himself. He cursed those honest shepherds who had given him false information. He should have known, he said, that any of them who were left free to feed their flocks must be on good terms with the patrols, German and Slovak. They did not seek vengeance as we did for innumerable brutalities, but wanted only peace and a good price for spring lambs. Daylight showed us that the valley ended in a slope of scree, which could easily be traversed. We halted to draw breath, and a moment later we were diving for the cover of rocks, leaving 2 more of our dead on the ground. Further progress was impossible, and if our retreat was blocked, then this was the end. The way up and out of the valley had only been vaguely on my mind, for of course it offered no special difficulty to a boy who could leave his pony at the bottom and scramble up the scree if he wished. What I did remember was a raven's nest to which I had climbed. It had been on the flat lip of a buttress thrust out from the cliff very near the top. A tangle of wind-swept sticks hanging over the edge showed that the nest was still there. It occurred to me that if I could get up our light machine gun, I should be well above the enemy position and in excellent cover. "But are you sure you can get there?" the voivod asked. "Yes, with the help of 2 men. How long will it take you to get up?" 20 minutes at a guess. Well, we can only hope we have that long. Our climb was out of sight of the enemy all the way. We pulled and pushed the machine gun up and set it level. We looked through the sticks and dead roots of the twigs and were startled at what we saw. We saw above the machine gun posts on both sides of the scree and above the even heathland behind it, where the enemy's front line was lying down in dead ground. The rest of the small but powerful force was idling and smoking a little way back, satisfied spectators of the destruction of this pestilent scourge of the Tatra frontiers. I was equally satisfied. They were all Germans. The ravens would not be hungry. Our first burst of plunging fire took out the gunners on both sides of the scree. The men lying on the edge jumped up and bolted back to the shelter of the scrubby woodland behind. Only 2 of them reached it. We were clear of a trap which we had scurried into, and at once struck north to the green forests and dark pines which were the natural home of the band. No time, thank God, could be wasted in stripping and shooting the wounded. We had to be far away when the force advancing along the rugged bottom of the valley climbed up to the scene, where the ravens were already wheeling overhead. After nightfall we were safe, and the survivors of our right-hand column were drifting in. They were all infinitely grateful to me, and pressed me to stay with them, but understood that I wanted to reach the army of the Middle East. "I would have taken you nearer to Romania if we hadn't been caught in those damned fields," said the voivod. "But now we shall have to fall back into Poland and reform. If you and your good Jew wish to go on alone, I can let you have a Romanian from the Bukovina who has business across the frontier and can be your guide. He speaks German. His name is Vasily Cantescu." I asked if he were trustworthy, for I thought it likely he would be anti-Russian rather than anti-German. "Yes, I know he was condemned to death. And he dares to go back? He will cross the frontier as a poor farmer from the Bukovina who was stripped by the Russians of everything he possessed. Such refugees are welcome if their birth certificates show they are pure Romanian. He won't stay long. Just to see a friend, he says." "How far is it to the frontier?" "About 70 miles. Say 4 days. I asked if he could spare some food and a horse for Moishe. "Yes, of course. And never forget," he added, "that Romania is Hitler's loyal ally, stuffed with troops and SD. Somewhere there exists an underground, but I suspect it will be of more use to Shapir than to you." There is little to tell of our journey. It was the same old story. Up and down from forest to forest, plodding along over grass and moorland. Moishe and I were indistinguishable from peasants, filthy, bearded, wrapped in rags and sheepskins. Cantescu was rather more respectable. In an emergency he was to ride the horse, and we should follow behind, thus giving a picture of a poor farmer and 2 of his men. We aimed to enter Romania at Siget, leaving behind the vast German-occupied mess. Cantescu was all right. He had his birth certificate showing him to be a Romanian citizen from the Bukovina. That would give him entry. It looked as if Moishe Shapir, recognizable as a Jew and with no papers at all, would have to cross the frontier illegally. As I was much more likely to succeed in that than he, I was prepared to lend him the passport of Don Ernesto, who was making his way from Poland to the sea in the hope of getting home. "What a pity you speak only German," I exclaimed. "And of course my native language." "What's that?" "Spanish." I should have guessed it. Those keen, aristocratic features were of course those of a Sephardic Jew. I examined him closely, as if I myself were a customs officer. Cleaned up, with his owl's nest of a beard neatly trimmed, and preserving Don Ernesto's moustache, he could perfectly well be a descendant of the Spanish conquerors. But still there were difficulties in fitting his description to the passport which had served both me and von Lauern. He was not tall enough. His eyes were brown, not grey. His hair was dark, not fair. Cantescu said cheerfully that we should leave it to him. A Romanian, he said, should not bother planning for trouble, but talk his way out of it when it came. He thought I ought to stick to Don Ernesto's passport, and that Moisha should be my faithful servant, who had had money and passport stolen. He was sure he could fix it. All we needed was a pair of scissors and a good wash. Failing scissors, he would sharpen his hunting knife and do his best. Hairdressing with a knife is a process I could recommend to the Gestapo. Cantescu took off my beard, leaving me with the wreck of a moustache and a bleeding lip. He then started on Moisha, giving him a pointed Velasquez beard and a rather better moustache than mine. We came out horribly unshaven, as was natural enough for travellers, but obviously gentlemen down on their luck. We had to promote the distinguished Moisha from servant to secretary. In the early morning we went down into the foothills and on towards the fast and shining river beyond which was Romania. I nervously assured myself of the long odds against Romanian security officers being warned that Don Ernesto Menendez-Peraza, killed in the bombing attack on Rostock, was very much alive, and that there was still nothing to connect Don Ernesto with the SD officer at Stettin, Auschwitz, and Krakow. All the same, I nearly turned back when I spotted a couple of black uniforms among the greys and blues of the Romanian army and officials. At the barrier we presented ourselves, our horse and our papers. Moisha and I had agreed that he spoke only Spanish, and I Spanish and German. So we stood by, looking bewildered and as dignified as our dirty sheepskins permitted, while Cantescu told our story. On his way back to his dear homeland, he had come across us on foot in the Tatra, our car waylaid and stolen by Slovakian bandits when we were driving down to Romania. As we were obviously persons of some importance, he had taken pity on us and guided us to the frontier. And then it was my turn. I said that I had hoped to get home to Nicaragua from Sweden, but could not. My secretary and I therefore decided to try and reach neutral Turkey and see what chance we had there. The officer returned my passport after taking longish notes and told me that he would have to refer the matter to other authorities, which, I feared, meant those hangers-on of the Gestapo. He would not accept poor Moisha at all. Cantescu protested, but the conversation was courteous and appeared to be leading somewhere. "He wants to know where you got the horse," he said. "I told him you bought it from a gypsy." There was more cordial conversation. "He says that horses are scarce in this part of the country. The Germans and Russians have taken the lot. He would allow me to take it in if it belonged to me." "It can belong to the devil for all I care." "Patience! Would you like to give the horse to me as a reward for saving your lives? And it had better be in writing." I scribbled a sort of deed of gift, and Cantescu and I shook hands on it while the immigration officer beamed at us. "I am now going through with the horse, and you will not see any more of me till perhaps this evening. For the present, you and Moisha will have to wait. But when you are allowed into Siget, you will find that I have booked you a room at the hotel." I still did not understand. I said goodbye to Cantescu warmly, but suspected he was talking us into trouble, not out of it. Then Moisha and I sat down on a melancholy bench in the waiting room. We were there till mid-afternoon, when the officer returned, saluted me, put an arm round Moisha's shoulders, and told us we were free to leave. A grubby one-horse cab awaited us and took us to the small hotel, white and with little welcoming windows. The Middle East was that much nearer, but there was still a nagging fear in my mind of those apparently idle black uniforms and the notes that the grey uniform had taken.
Michael Jayston was reading episode 3 of Rogue Justice by Geoffrey Household. The book was abridged by Patricia Hanna, and the producer was David Jackson Young. Rogue Justice by Geoffrey Household. Read by Michael Jayston. Episode 4.
With Cantescu's help, and in exchange for our horse, Moisha and I had obtained safe passage across the frontier into Romania at Siget. Cantescu had indeed booked a room for us in the small hotel, and in the town we found a barber's shop. Afterwards we sat down to an excellent meal. Rather to my surprise, Cantescu turned up to help us with our bottle. I congratulated him on his country's officials, who seemed most reasonable. "The passport officer's brother is a farmer," he explained, "but not a horse in sight, and he is nearly ruined." When I heard that, I felt so sorry for him that I offered him ours, and as soon as I had quietly stabled the horse where he instructed me, he kept his word and let you pass. A reasonable arrangement between two honest men. He told me that I could safely stay in the hotel for the night. Next day I must move. He would tell me where. My passport would be good enough for hotels and railways. "In a few minutes Shapir and I will go for a stroll in the dusk. Don't say goodbye, and look as if you were expecting him back. One never knows what eyes are watching." I had told Moshe that I would never leave him until he was in safety or dead, so I said to Cantescu that I would only hand him over to his own people. "Good, if he can find any. It's as bad as that. Worse. I will only tell you both what you already know, that death is close behind you. Trust me to make him keep his distance." Moshe got up to go with Cantescu, and our eyes had to speak for us, since we were allowed no show of emotion and no goodbyes. In the morning I paid my bill, and found that my store of marks would be still enough for second-class travel, food and bed for a couple of nights. Then I waited in the bar for something to happen, like any commercial traveller stranded in the third-rate hotel of some provincial town. Life began again when the hotel porter handed me an envelope addressed to Don Ernesto. It contained nothing but a third-class ticket to Bucharest by the evening train. At the station, I found my way onto the train with a crowd of peasants, and settled down on a slatted wooden seat, of which I occupied 18 inches, between some underpaid clerk, who reeked of pickled cucumber, and on the other side a hearty, drunken yeoman of the Bukovina, who continually farted, laughed, and apologized. We travelled all night, with both my neighbours dozing on my shoulders. At 11 in the morning we piled out onto Bucharest station. My papers were inspected, and my ticket collected, and I set out into a busy city of low white houses, and trees and tram lines, and poverty, already in the pleasant heat of early summer. I presumed that since I had been given a ticket, someone must be observing my movements, and when I came to a cafe, sat down at an outside table, where I could easily be seen and discreetly contacted if the someone chose to come along. Before long, a taxi drew up alongside the cafe, and the driver reported to me exactly as if I had ordered it. I got in, and we drove across a handsome boulevard and away to a suburb of small houses and yards, which looked unchanged since Bucharest was a large village. The car stopped in a small square with an onion-domed church in the centre, and the driver signalled to me to get out. As I made as if to pay him, he gave me in French some such directions as first right, second left, number 11, go straight in. I went straight in, and found myself in a simple room with a bed made up and a dressing-gown lying on it, a comfortable chair, a table set with coffee, rolls, and a carafe of plum brandy, and, best of all, a civilized lavatory and shower. So, I was expected, and my probable needs foreseen. I threw into a corner my sheepskin, and the now ragged suit which Casimir had given me, took a shower, put on the dressing-gown, and breakfasted. It all seemed the lap of luxury to Don Ernesto. Death, as Cantescu had warned, might be looking over my shoulder, but meanwhile I revelled in the touch of a silk dressing-gown which called for Noel Coward to do it justice. Thinking it was about time I had some instructions, I waited for my host. There were curious faint thumps from the lavatory, which I put down to the whims of Romanian plumbing. The door was opened from the inside by a woman who remarked in charmingly accented English, "Good morning, Don Ernesto." "Good morning, madam. May I thank you and congratulate you on your efficiency? If spiders can come up, I can. Then at last I have found someone who can tell me why they aren't drowned. What I meant was that I don't see how your people spotted me on the station." "Oh, that was easy. Cantescu had a man travelling on the train." She was in her early 30s, and lovely as well as witty. Dark hair, laughing grey eyes, classical features which were not too severe, and skin, to judge by her forearms in a summer frock, as soft as the bloom on a fruit. A lot of trouble for a Slovakian bandit, I said, but for a British agent, no trouble is enough. I am British, but not an agent. That is what the voivode thought. He called you a fighting man, too proud for a spy. It's true, I don't like the Nazis. Don't like? You are a flame of hatred, he said, and it seems there is another side to you. You remember Mr. Shapir? I only parted from him the day before yesterday. He said to the voivode that never in his life had he known such love and tenderness. It was an extraordinary tribute from Moisha, to whom, I should have thought, I gave the impression of a ruthless killer. He is safe? What a question. Are you? Am I? I don't know where he is, but you must stay here until we have a sure route to Turkey for you. Show me what papers you have. I gave her the Nicaraguan passport, telling her that it belonged to one of Hitler's agents, whom I had killed. The trouble was that the SD knew it and were on the lookout for me all over Europe. And you have nothing else? I slit open the wide hem of my sheepskin coat and produced Haas's documents. To start with, I had his uniform too, and it helped me to escape from Germany. But no one could mistake the photograph for me. We must fix the photograph, she said. I'm sure we can, if your forger is reliable. Otherwise a word from him, and it's the end of us. You will not mind if I come to talk to you from time to time? The spider will be careful not to come up when you are, well, engaged. And may I know how she gets in? The floor of your shower cabinet is hinged, and steps lead up from a passage. It's the cellar of a house which was knocked down in the earthquake, and my friends and I built this room on top. We foresaw trouble before the Germans arrived. I sometimes entertain the least awful of their officers. Very correct they are. They like to think I'm a true Aryan princess. I'm not surprised. Straight out of Wagner? For God's sake, no. I am descended from Byzantine emperors. Lovely pure blood. Greeks, barbarians, Egyptians. A complex creature, that mermaid spider. And what am I to call you? Just Domnitsa, the little lady? Now, we must get you some decent clothes, so that you can move on the streets when the time comes. I have brought a tape measure. What class would you like to belong to? Poor, but honest. Some craftsman who can only afford one suit every 3 years, and the cloth must last. The intimacy of measurement was pleasurable, but no more than a sister's caress. When a man has loved as I, he remembers too clearly the divine dual surrender of the spirits for any imitation by mere bodies to be tolerable. My suit, when it appeared, was of brown serge, hideous, indestructible as old friendship, but infernally hot in the flowering June of Bucharest. The photograph on Haas's comprehensive pass was a perfect job. Domnitsa herself had taken it, laughing at her attempts to get me to compose my face into the stolid insensitivity of a Gestapo officer. Her tame craftsman had successfully reproduced the embossed stamp. But if anyone had reason to suspect it, and used a magnifying glass, he could detect that one photograph had been substituted for another. I now had 3 different proofs of identity. Hidden in the lining of my brown serge suit were Haas's papers and Don Ernesto's passport. In my pocket was the identity card of a Greek seaman from a coaster plying between Romanian and Turkish ports. My Greek was not nearly good enough, but it would pass, so long as I was not speaking to a Greek. A day of normal city life restored some confidence. I lunched. I sat in public parks. I was only an ant in an ant-hill. That night, I was woken up by the familiar swish of the shower cabinet. A complete stranger entered my room, an old man with a bushy beard, who would have looked like Father Christmas, except that he was very formally dressed. He was obviously a prince or politician of the old school up from his remote estate in the country. "Cantescu, at your service," he said with a slight and graceful bow. The disguise was perfect. "And where have you left your carriage and pair?" I asked. "In this square," he replied. I could not tell whether that was the incredible truth, or whether he was just answering jest with jest. He went on to say that the more conspicuous you made yourself, the less likely you were to be a wanted man, typical of these daring Romanians, but I doubt it. He had dropped in on me to arrange what he called a few details of my departure. "Tomorrow we are proposing to ship you on an old tanker from the port of Constanza to Istanbul. You are a Greek seaman off a barge laid up in the Danube, and you want to go home. The papers are very simple, and we can manage them, all properly stamped. I don't know what action the Turks will take. Probably put you on any Greek caïque in the harbour, but you'll have every chance to run for the British consulate. I might have none. At least the Nicaraguan passport would prevent me being returned to the ship." "If you insist, you can go on board as Don Ernesto," he said. "But you must land as a nameless seaman. The oil engineer is a trusty agent. You will recognize him by his slicked-down grey hair. On arrival at Istanbul, he will make arrangements for smuggling you ashore and tell you what to do." I left next day as secretly as I had arrived, carrying a small case containing toiletries and the invaluable sheepskin coat, now cleaned and deloused, with Hauptmann Haas's papers in the lining. Domnitzer did not come to say goodbye, but sent me a small locket which opened into a diptych, showing on one leaf an icon of St. Jerome, and on the other the head and shoulders of some Byzantine princess, so like her that her meaning was clear. No cabin had been prepared for me on the tanker, but I was allowed to doss down in the sick bay. We sailed in the evening, and late the following afternoon, the tanker anchored off the oil terminal at Istanbul. The oil engineer called on me after dark and told me that all was arranged. There was a boat close under the bows, and a rope hanging down from the rail. The boatman would take me into the press of ferryboats on the Stamboul waterfront, one of which had been told to row me across the Horn to Pera. The plan worked with a precision which surprised me, though it was far from easy to descend the rope with a case in one hand, even one as light as mine. We drifted silently away into the reflected light of the city, passed under the bridge, and there, side by side, were the little ferries. Unobserved, I was transferred to one of them. Unobserved, too, I was landed at the dark steps on the other side of the Horn. The Romanian engineer seemed most efficient. I had now only to walk to the consulate, and Cantescu had explained to me exactly where it was. At the top of the steps my arms were seized by a man on each side of me, and a gun shoved in my back. They ordered me to come with them without any fuss. Since they were speaking German, and sure that I understood it, the game was up, but I pretended to think they were a pair of ordinary thugs, dropped my case, and offered to show them that the contents were of no value. Ordered to pick it up and come along, I managed to slip Don Ernesto's deadly passport out of my pocket, and, when I stood up, to push it over the edge of the steps with my foot. That efficiency which I had admired could now be explained. The oil engineer was a double agent, profitably working for both the Romanian underground and the SD's bureau in Turkey. I was driven up the hill to Galata, and led into a pleasant little mansion, which had no pretensions to secrecy. No doubt the British operatives were equally well known to the Turks, and made themselves just as comfortable. As was proper in a neutral country, nobody was in uniform, and the room to which I was taken for interrogation might have been the office of any prosperous merchant. The man facing me across the desk was, however, true to the clean national type, a large, beer-sodden, greasy Aryan with pimples on his forehead.
"Who are you? A Pole? A Romanian?"
"You have no right to question me. I will explain my movements to Turkish police and no one else."
"Search him."
They went through my case right down to the toothpaste and shaving soap. Then they stretched out the faithful sheepskin coat and felt it over, at once discovering the packet of Hauptmann Haas's papers.
"Major, we have caught the missing Haase."
I remained silent. It looked as if my painstaking arrangements for the death of Ernesto Menendez Peraza and the disappearance of Haase in the bombing of Rostock had been successful. It was plain that Don Ernesto was assumed to be dead, and his name had never reached any blacklist.
Swine, deserter, murderer of your comrades, are now caught on your way to the enemy.
My only hope was to show calm and confidence. I must ask you, Major, to look carefully at my documents. You will see that I am entitled to report directly to the headquarters of the Sicherheitsdienst. I can only tell you that I have been on special duty, connected with the infiltration of the Romanian underground, which you will appreciate could be a danger to our lines of communication. I know nothing of any murders, and I require you to explain the folly of arresting me when it was essential that my presence in Istanbul should not be known.
Folly of arresting? You, who have connived at the escape of prisoners, slaughtered guards, and then gunned down a detachment sent to capture you?
So it had been decided that the mysterious Gestapo officer who had committed all these crimes was Haase. And deserter too? I asked, ironically. He started to pound on the desk, while beads of sweat appeared among the pimples. I had him shaken.
Confess what happened after the raid on Rostock.
With pleasure. My orders were to interrogate a certain person in Rostock, and to take action immediately upon any information received, before his associates could be aware of his arrest. He was due to die anyway, but was killed in the raid. Can that be confirmed by Berlin? Of course, if they choose to do so. And at the same time I shall be compelled to report that a most secret mission has been aborted by the officious idiocy of a bunch of petty policemen, who should never have been allowed to enter the service.
With your permission, sir,
began the only one of my kidnappers who was not impressed.
It is possible that this fellow is not Haase, but has Haase's papers.
I remarked, still contemptuous, that the stamped photograph in that case could not possibly be me. I lost a trick there. The Major picked up the telephone and demanded,
"Is there anyone here who has served with Hauptmann Haase and knows him?"
There was a considerable delay before the answer came back that the head of the Gestapo at Salonika knew Haase well, and would be most willing to identify him. The Gestapo chief was too busy to fly to Istanbul, but the officer in question could be flown to Salonika. One of the Major's aides said that there was a plane going to Salonika in the morning.
"It's laid on for General Kurtbeck of the Turkish Ordnance. I'll find out if there is room for 2 civilians. But the Turks will need proof of identity. Suppose this man refuses to go and asks for help. If he does, it's proof enough that he isn't Haase."
It was time for me to show the indignation that the real Haase would have done.
"This is all pig swill," I stormed. "I am what my documents say I am. I am not likely to sing out at the airport. Order the consul to issue a passport for me in any name you please. It must all be done discreetly. And as soon as I am identified, I must be returned at once to Istanbul to carry out my assignment."
By now they had all accepted the probability that I really was Hauptmann Haase of the Sicherheitsdienst, and that Haase was not that mysterious officer who had left behind such a trail of devastation at Stettin and on the road to Krakow. The Major actually apologized to me for the accommodation he was compelled to offer for the night. It was their prison cell, but he was sure that I would understand that he was bound officially to take precautions. Early in the morning, a German passport in the name of Ludwig Weber was brought to me to sign. My case and Haase's documents were returned. We left for the airport. My guard was armed and made sure that I could see he was. The plane was a little Fokker-Wulf with 4 seats behind the pilot. To preserve the decencies, I was presented to General Kurtbeck as a distinguished German industrialist. He sat on my left, with the Gestapo guard behind us, and turned out to have the affability of a genial European and the courtesy of a Moslem gentleman. His uniform was more or less British, with Sam Brown belt and revolver. We soon got into conversation, using English, which he spoke with an entertaining blend of guttural accent and clipped British Army speech. Ludwig Weber complained that before the war the Turkish army had been largely equipped by the British, and added, "You are not coming in on their side, I hope."
"You bet your life we are not," he replied.
I am going to Salonika to examine some of your latest armor. Your Mark IV tank is better than anything the British have got. An inspiration. I saw half a chance, and my guard did not speak English. Better soldiers than we expected, I said, but poorly equipped. For example, take that 38 you have there. It's badly balanced. He did exactly what I had dared to hope, pulled it out of the holster and weighed it on the palm of his right hand. I grabbed it, whipped round, shot my guard, and finished him off with a second. "Don't move, sir. I mean you no harm at all." I then dealt with the startled pilot. I shoved the muzzle into the back of his neck. "You will make a course for Thessaly. I warn you that I know Greece well. I also warn you that I shall be shot when we reach Salonika, so I don't mind if I die now. Don't touch your radio. You will put us down somewhere flat in the valley of the river Aliakmon." Olympus and the Aliakmon were clear, but anything flat enough to land on was not. The pilot came down, explored, and chose a cultured strip of corn. We crashed through the young stems and demolished a vineyard, coming to rest with one wing well dug in and the tail in the air. Beyond bruises, none of us was hurt. Men were running out from a white village. The pilot had no fear of them, aware that Greek villagers knew very well what would happen to them if a German was attacked. The general was none too certain of his status. He remarked that if a Turk were present at any disaster, the Greeks could be trusted to put the blame on him. I saw that there was no reason why he should be recognized as a Turk if he remained bareheaded and ripped off his flashy epaulets. "For a moment let us both be British," I suggested. "We have some proof." I pointed to the dead guard. "A pity he's not in uniform." "Which uniform would he be wearing?" "Black, the Gestapo." "And you were his prisoner?" "On the way to the firing squad." By this time we were surrounded by a band of cautious but very angry Greeks, demanding compensation for the damage. In my inadequate Greek, I assured them that they would get it as long as they treated the pilot with courtesy. "And the British officer?" one asked. "Did he kill that man?" "I killed him." "And you also are British?" When I replied that I was, there was a great excitement. They forgot all about the crops and wanted to show us the way to the sea at once. I managed to produce a mangled and incredible story that the British officer was a prisoner on parole, and that it was against his honour to try to escape. This resulted in a further wave of admiration for the British. I repeated it to the general, telling him that I was off to the mountains of Macedonia, and he could be quite certain of lunch. He shook my hand warmly, and hoped we would meet again. "Shan't ask you to return the revolver," he said. "Trust you'll find it not so poorly balanced after all. And look here, old man, you're going to need this, and I can always complain you pinched it." He shoved into my pocket a mixed wad of German marks and Greek drachmas. "Just a way of saying thank you for London in the 1930s, and all those splendid messes where I was entertained. I was then assistant military attaché. 2 of the villagers took me straight up into the mountains, after I had threatened them with my revolver, so that both pilot and general could swear they had not given me willing assistance. As soon as I reasonably could, I sent them back to their village, and turned towards the Aliakmon, where towards evening I found myself among the remains of mounds and trenches. Whether they dated from this war or the last, I did not know, but the derelict defences offered a night's lodging. The air was warm, and carried the scents of the herbs of Greece. I had no need of the fleecy coat around me. I lay there considering what sort of damage a single man, carrying on his private war, could do to the enemy, with no skills but those of the hunter and lone rover. When the sun came up, I took stock of the unknown landscape. West of the river, a range of mountains closed the horizon. They were very different to the high Carpathians, with their steep, dark valleys, where an armed band could disappear and defy pursuit. Here was rock under intensely blue sky, and only low scrub for cover, all at the comfortable height of some 4,000 feet. In such a canopy of light, it seemed to me that to be safe, an outlaw could be no larger than a rabbit. However, there were hints of precipice and gorge, and for the present there was nowhere else to make my home. First I had to cross the river. Downstream was a bridge with a steady flow of German military traffic. The bridge obviously would be heavily guarded, so there was nothing for it but an early morning plunge into the fast current, pushing ahead a piece of timber revetment with my clothes and my few possessions. Then I climbed up into what would be my hunting ground, hungrily eager to explore it and see what prey it might hold.
Michael Jayston was reading episode 4 of Rogue Justice by Geoffrey Household. The book was abridged by Patricia Hannah, and the producer was David Jackson Young. Rogue Justice by Geoffrey Household. Read by Michael Jayston. Episode 5.
Villages were few in these Greek mountains. They clung to the slopes like a scatter of nesting gulls, one house above the other. For the first few days I did not visit any of them, and spent my time in search for my future headquarters, sometimes sleeping in shallow caves, and sometimes in the thick scrub of the ridges. My first contact was with a goat herd. When I had answered his questions, and he had found out that I was British and on the run, his first reaction was to say without any regard for possible consequence, "You must come to my house, and we will have a party." I thanked him profusely as one gentleman to another, but said that at the same time I might have to kill, and I refused to risk reprisals against his village. I asked him what troops there were in the village. "Many, many," he said, "at Kosani and on the roads." The town of Kosani seemed to be at a crossroads of strategic importance, one running south from Macedonia to Athens over the Aliakmon Bridge, the other to Salonika, so a garrison had to be kept there. Are there partisans to keep them busy? No. All are over to the west. Here is nowhere for a band to retreat and be safe. Indeed, there was not. But one man could vanish when a dozen couldn't. I asked whether the troops had left no arms behind. No, but I know where there are arms. I was now, I fear, a little irresponsible. But I was bitter at being chased half across Europe with no chance to do anything but snap back at the pursuit like a wolf with its tail between its legs. Where was my private war? Attack! I wanted to turn to the attack. Under a half-moon, it was easy enough to traverse the slope and reach the spur. Once on the top, I could see the lights of Kosani, and make out a small blockhouse by the side of the road below me, which was presumably the quarters of a German patrol. Beneath the roof were wide slits showing lights. Quite unconcerned, they were within, and possibly drinking, for one of them went out to a field latrine, leaving the door open behind him. My first shot scored on the concrete, for range and my altitude were hard to guess. My second got him. Two of the guards incautiously dashed out to see what on earth was going on in this place of peace and passing transport. They never did see. Then a machine gun started up from the embrasure under the roof, firing at the flashes. He would certainly have bagged me if I had not dived for the shelter of a handy rock. He even managed to knock the top off that. The gunner seemed to be the last of them, for nobody came out to try an attack on foot. I crawled along the slope of the spur, out of that too accurate line of fire, and round to the door, which he had had time to shut. On the next occasion when he thought he saw something and loosed off into the darkness, drowning all other noise, I tried the door, which swung open at a touch. He and his gun were on a raised platform, and he was staring intently into the night. This time I used the Turkish general's revolver. Complete triumph. It was plain that as soon as the 4 bodies were discovered, the kindly goatherd and his village would be annihilated. I had to keep suspicion away from them. Experience offered a fair parallel. When you have collected the remains of a man-eater's kill, you will find the trademark of the killer, and you will know whether he or she is resident, or as padded for many hungry miles from some faraway district. The same principle applied. I would leave my trademark. There was an official logbook in the blockhouse. I tore off 4 pages and wrote on each in German, "Mit Komplimenten von einem Untermensch zum Herrenvolk." Hard to translate into English, because, thank God, the conception of the Untermensch has never occurred to us. Perhaps degenerate will do, which for the Nazis included Jews, Poles, Russians, other Slavs, and, if they had not been allies, probably Italians. I took 4 table knives and pinned the notice to each of my victims, having of course ensured that they were dead. The relief force could not possibly hold the villagers responsible, for none of them could speak German, let alone write it. For the rest of the night I travelled slowly west, until stopped by the deep and narrow gorge of the Aliakmon. Dawn revealed a savage country, a desert of ravines where only infantry could go. The gorge might do for a base, if and when I decided to call off the battle, but it was too far from Kazani for observation and attack. To continue vengeance, unremitting vengeance, or to disengage and escape to the coast. The second alternative was perhaps my duty. I could serve Europe better in the armed forces than on my own. I set out to explore my new territory. The range was narrower, with more plentiful stands of pine. The country gave an impression of emptiness, villages being far away from each other, and tending to hug the flanks of the range. From the high ground one could see for miles. I picked out 2 troop carriers full of black uniformed Gestapo, apparently doing a round of the villages to question and threaten. There was also a party on foot working the western side of the mountains. For the sake of the local inhabitants, I left them alone. To kill 1 or 2 at long range would only increase fear and anger, which they would take out on the villagers. In the evening, when my hunters had packed up and gone home, I risked the noise of a shot and bagged a hare. Grilled over a fire built in a cleft of the rocks, it gave me the first satisfying meal for several days, so that I was ready to explore a piece of the night and gain some mental picture of the tracks which led from one faint constellation of candlelight to another. I threaded my way between boulders and bushes, walking blindly, for the stars were hidden. When a distant, dimly lit window showed me that a village was not far below, it seemed to me that a cold finger touched my cheek. I stopped short. Putting out a tentative hand, I found that it was indeed a finger which had touched me, and above it was an arm. A corpse, rags of clothing obscuring the outline, was hanging by its feet from a branch. I waited by the body till the first glimmer of dawn, to make sure what had happened, and whether or not I was concerned. The body was striped like a zebra, with dried blood, the clothes shredded by the whip. Did they believe that he had hidden me? Or was this cruelty just a warning to an innocent village of what would happen to anyone who gave me help? I stayed long enough to watch the black-veiled figures of 2 mourning women, his mother and his young wife, come out as soon as the light allowed, accompanied by the priest. I gathered from their high voices a lamentation that they did not dare to cut him down. If he was not still there for the crows when the next detachment of the Gestapo passed, another would hang from the branch in his place. The craggy, rugged top of the range was going to be too hot to hold me, so I decided to make for the Aliakmon, which I had inspected after my attack on the blockhouse. I crossed the road, intending to travel with caution during the remaining hours of daylight, and after dark to make all possible speed along made paths. While I was trotting along a mule path at the bottom of a twisting valley, with no cover on either side, a light plane swooped round the bend behind, unheard until it was nearly over me. I could see woodland ahead, but it was too late for sheltering pines to be of any use to me now. My position, trapped within the right-angled bend of the Aliakmon, was desperate. The only way out was round the head of the river by night marches, and without a map. So far as I knew, that move would take me into Albania. I set off by starlight. The path was just distinguishable. As soon as heights could be discerned against the sky, I climbed the usual bare hillside and sat down to consider the next move. The country was broken, but much lower, forming a cultivated vale between the range I had crossed and the forested foothills of the Pindus Mountains. It was another land into which I had come. I looked directly down to the village to which the path had been leading me, and could watch its normal morning life. There was something odd about the midday scene. Outside the tavern, civilians apparently on good terms with uniforms. They were not German uniforms. Only then did I remember that in the collapse of 1941, Albania and Epirus had been surrendered to the Italians, who could be expected to provide the military government and the occupying forces. In order to escape, or in self-defense, I might have to kill Italians, but the overriding motive of revenge was no more. My private war was over. In the heat of the early afternoon, when all was quiet, I started out towards the forests on the slopes of Pindus. I was several miles from the village, when suddenly, and too close for retreat, a detachment of Italian troops emerged from some ancient olive trees. I raised my hands and shouted that I was German, which at least I could prove by the passport in the name of Ludwig Weber. The bayonet destined for my stomach wavered to one side, and what with surprise on a loose stone, the man behind it tripped. I helped him to his feet, and he excitedly took his ally prisoner. The Italian officer before whom they marched me was a pleasant young man who spoke fair German. Not that it prejudiced him in my favour. Rather the opposite. I produced the Ludwig Weber passport, and claimed to be an expert road engineer, a civilian employed in Turkey who had been asked to report on possible sources of first-class road metal close to the main roads used by the army. A possible, though unlikely, appointment which could not easily be checked with the SD or army staff. "You expect me to believe that you were sent out alone to collect the metal?" "Only to report on the geology, sir. Not on our troop movements and administration. But I am a civilian." "Who can speak Greek?" "A little." "You Germans are not as frank with your allies as you should be. You have put me in a very difficult position." I had. It was embarrassing to return a spy to allies, and he was too human to report an unknown Ludwig Weber killed in action, as the SD would have done. In the sensible Italian manner, he decided that when in doubt, shift the responsibility onto a superior officer. Orders were given that I should be shipped under open arrest to Taranto, where there was an intelligence centre with experience of foreign agents and closer liaison with international affairs. I was provided with a clean shirt and trousers, and escorted down to Preveza, where a small transport was about to leave for Taranto, with naval ratings going on leave, and a few invalids from the army. I was allowed the freedom of the poop, but at night confined in a makeshift deck-house like a large chicken coop at the stern. I was able to enjoy the smooth and shining passage across the Ionian Sea without too much brooding over the professional intelligence organization which would quickly discover all that I was not, but would have trouble in finding out from Istanbul exactly what I was. On the first morning out, when we must have been about 50 miles south of the heel of Italy, I was waiting for breakfast when there was an almighty explosion. The chicken coop slid backwards and plunged into the sea. I anchored myself to the splintered door, and when I came to the surface, saw that all that remained of the ship was the bow section, evenly sliding under. Our navy must have secretly mined one of the approaches to Taranto in the hope of sinking a battleship or cruiser, for the effect on our little transport of not more than 300 tons was devastating. There were only a few bodies in the water, and most of these mangled by the explosion. Sitting on the shapeless roof of the deck-house, I seemed to be the only survivor. There was no reason to lose hope. I was close to the sea lane between Italy and Africa, and I was at last spotted by a convoy bound for Tripoli from Brindisi. An oil tanker lowered a boat and took me, Herr Ludwig Weber, on board. Officers and crew were all triumphant. A few more days, and the victorious Italian army would be in Alexandria. When we were some hours from the African coast, our ship was detached from the convoy with orders to make the port of Benghazi at night. Depressing news for me. There could be no chance of resuming my personal war. This Middle East, which had beckoned me on all the way from Stettin, now presented itself as an invincible enemy camp. There was not a light to be seen on ship or shore. We drove steadily for Benghazi, while, unknown to us, the slim black messenger of death was sliding through the darkness on a parallel course. The torpedo struck amidships. Boats and men plunged into the water, where the calm and spreading gloss of the oil unnaturally reflected light. I jumped with the rest, determined to reach the destroyer, a dim outline behind the searchlight now playing over the hull. I avoided the tanker's boats, swimming directly to the destroyer and calling for help, at last in my own dear language. I was home from my journey, or so I thought. My passport in the name of Ludwig Weber had gone to the bottom with my boots. I was accepted on board as unquestionably British, and gave my name as William Smith, a former resident of Italy who was being shifted from one internment camp to another. To have introduced myself under my true name might have resulted in questions which were better avoided until I reached land and the proper authorities. As soon as the destroyer docked at Haifa, I was put up at a seaman's hostel, told that I should be wanted for questioning, and that meanwhile I was at liberty to wander about the town. I walked among British troops, observed Jews and their laughing children, and exchanged friendly greetings with Arabs to see how much of my Swahili could be understood. Then I walked up the winding road to the top of Mount Carmel, and rejoiced in the sight of this peaceful and prosperous land. Though neither Jew nor Arab, I was home again. Home again. Had I any right to be? What home had she, who should have been at my side? No, I had no right to peace. It was not here above the crystalline Mediterranean that I would find her. Our union must come from some sacrifice, in which her blood and mine were mingled, never to be separated. I returned to the hostel, and found an army sergeant waiting for me. "Would you mind giving my commanding officer, Major North, a little of your time?" he said. The first approach of the British Gestapo. It was so comic that I couldn't help laughing, and said I would be delighted. I was driven to the Major's office. He sat behind a trestle table, covered with an army blanket, with two basket chairs opposite. The atmosphere was in no way threatening. I felt almost as if I had called to ask for a job with some tanned and travelled foreign correspondent. He had that sort of face, genial but politely sceptical. "Don't they fix up distressed seamen with a new outfit?" was his first question. "Perhaps I don't count as one, sir." "Well, I don't know their rules. I'll see what I can do. Now, I see you are Bill Smith on Mondays and Tuesdays, but Ludwig Weber when convenient. Or so we are told by the captain of the Italian oil tanker. A passport in that name was given to me by the German consulate in Istanbul. "And what is your true name?" he asked, accepting my reply without comment. It was no good prevaricating if I wished to be accepted into one of the British services. Raymond Ingleram. Borrowed, perhaps. Christened in St. George's Chapel, October 1909. Related to the royal family? Not near enough to count. My mother was Austrian. Why do you tell me that? Because you will find it out anyway. I'm also known to the enemy as Hauptmann Hase of the Sicherheitsdienst, and Ernesto Menendez Parada, citizen of Nicaragua. Are you employed by any of our private armies? You can safely tell me. Only by my own. I have fought the enemy for 3 years. He sat back, much more relaxed. Well, you don't seem the type to be a British fascist or a German agent. Until we decide what to do with you, I shall arrange for you to stay on at the hostel. Keep your mouth shut, don't draw attention to yourself in any way, and report to my Sergeant Major daily. Early one morning, a week later, I was driven by Major North down the coast road to Cairo, arriving at sunset, when my body was delivered to a fellow security officer. The house to which I was taken swarmed with officers and files. I was escorted into a private office. My interrogator was a brigadier, and had a proper civilian desk. On it was a thick file marked Raymond Ingelram, followed by a string of aliases, which I could not read. I disliked the brigadier at first sight. He had a dark moustache, more movie star than military, and a straight thin mouth beneath it, which seemed to carry a slight sneer, as if I were an incompetent subordinate who thought too highly of himself. I judged him coldly efficient. He started straight away with the report from Sweden. I had claimed to be an escaped prisoner of war, but it was discovered that I had been in Germany as a civilian since the outbreak of war, pretending to be Nicaraguan, and that I had spent 2 years on propaganda directed at Latin America. I had claimed that my motive was to get near to Hitler in order to kill him. Did I wish to confirm that story? Yes, I did. People in England seem to know very little about you, he said. I have been able to obtain some newspaper cuttings which indicate that at one time your travels and your habit of hunting with the nets and weapons of natives caught the attention of the popular press. They exaggerated. Are you known to any of the East African governors? I gave him names, saying that I hoped that if he approached them, he would tell them that I was being vetted for possible service in Africa, not as a supporter of Hitler. You are suspected of worse than that, Mr. Ingelram. You admit that you willingly allowed yourself to be employed in propaganda. I suggest that you tried to escape from the Reich before it was too late, and to clear your name and your conscience by what you call a private war. You will realize that it is quite impossible to leave you at liberty. In Egypt, however, the only internment camps are for Italian civilians. So I will send you home to be confined or publicly disgraced with the rest of your aristocratic Nazi friends. I will make it a recommendation that you be repatriated at a minimum cost to public funds by any ship returning round the Cape. Do you agree? I was decently treated when I went on board a freighter at Suez. Evidently the master had been told that he should keep a careful eye on me, but not that I had been an enemy agent. He believed, so far as I could guess, that I was a person of some distinction, who had committed some unforgivable folly, such as seducing the King of Egypt's daughter, or dancing a drunkard's jig in the cathedral. The ship was to call at Mombasa, a port which I knew well, and there I proposed to leave it. I had never any intention of going home. My future did not matter. I had renounced the future, and lived only in a past which contained, coexisting with me, the spectral vision of my love. The captain did not object to me going ashore at Mombasa. He had no reason to suspect that I might disappear, since I was on my way home, and had no money. I walked out of town along the railway. A freight train was halted, hissing impatiently alongside a banana grove. I climbed into a truck half full of gravel, and no one disturbed me until I got off in the Nairobi yards 3 hours later. From Nairobi I travelled to Lake Tanganyika with a Belgian mining engineer, who had employed me to take charge of his small safari. He had no luck. As we were travelling up the Ruzizi River, I went down with a tropical fever, which must have been rather more virulent than malaria, against which I was pretty well salted. The Belgian was inexperienced, in a hurry, and afraid of fevers in general, so he put me in a hammock, and 2 runners dropped the shivering bundle like an unwanted baby upon the steps of the nunnery 30 miles away, where it seemed to me in my fevered dreams that white seagulls in a cloud were swooping over me. They turned out to be the white robes of an heroic little group of Belgian nuns, who combined a hutted hospital with farming of fruit, herbs and vegetables, and a small herd of fly-proof cows. They soon had a Bill Smith in working order, and then asked him where he wanted to go. I answered that I wanted to stay with them and serve them, requiring only my food and an outlying watertight hut of my own. There were many tasks that a man could undertake for them more easily. The Mother Superior asked me to swear that I was not a fugitive from justice. Leaving out the Gestapo, who had no interest in justice, and the Brigadier, a limited man who could not do justice without papers, I could honestly swear that I was a fugitive from no one but myself. But why? Because my love was killed. I could not bring myself to tell her how, or of my vengeance. Yet you are so full of love to us and to the animals. Cannot you love God too? I do. At dawn with the birds, and at evening with the beasts. It is true that in the evening I join in the thanks offered up by the cries of the beasts around me. They have accepted me as of the same substance as these angels, whom they do not fear. But there is one I wish had more fear. Killing is too easy for her. I have tried a dozen tricks to frighten her away. But she is impertinent, like all cats. She knows me too well, and I could swear she is jealous of the nuns. She has the white robes fluttering for the safety of the house. But with me, in the last of the light, she will exchange a quick, green glance, as if there was some secret understanding between us. Yesterday she jumped the enclosure and killed a cow. That cannot be permitted. Also, I am a little afraid for the white robes. The margin between lack of respect and attack is so small. She has to die, my lioness of the twilight. I have forbidden myself to shoot, but there is still another way, and in the Sudan I dared it successfully, hurled to the ground under my shield, unhurt. One must provoke a direct charge, and I am not sure that charge she will. Another absolute essential is a strong shield of hippopotamus hide and a broad spear of steel, forged by a skilled blacksmith. The headman has both in his hut, emblems of the past manhood of his tribe. I must inspect them closely and see if they are up to the job. And then, my dear, the rest is up to you. If you will not charge, it cannot be done. If you will, and I can hold the spear steady as you leap, the pain will be no more than that of a bullet. One or both of us must make the sacrifice of blood. Not until you are ready will I know, lioness of love and courage.
Michael Jayston was reading the final episode of Rogue Justice by Geoffrey Household. The book was abridged by Patricia Hannah, and the producer was David Jackson Young.